Good morning, everybody. Morning. So this time, as advertised, I'm going to talk about the Buddhist wisdom leading us to human happiness. This lecture is divided into 4 parts: today's, tomorrow's, and then we will have April's 2 lectures, altogether 2 lectures. For today and tomorrow's lecture, we will focus on the Buddhist teaching of Four Noble Truths. Perhaps a lot of you know about these Four Noble Truths, but most of you, or perhaps some of you, learned from the Buddhist textbooks. But it's very difficult for those who read the textbook and, apply it to human life, in our actual life. In American, there is a Buddhist monk, and he's called Bhikkhu Bodhi, and he wrote a long article on this, and he explained it very clear, and in so many ways, he said that it's very important to, apply these teachings in our life. And first, I will highlight the important things that we human beings, in fact, we search for happiness. Whatever religions you are, whatever the social society, tradition, or the country you live, we have a common goal. And this goal is to look for human happiness. Some people looking for material things, while others are looking into religious aspects of life. And most of the religions, of course, there are so many different kinds of guidelines and wanted to guide us to happiness. But we, as ordinary people, usually ignore these kind of guidelines. Buddhism is a religion, in fact, also dealing with human life, particularly dealing with human problems. Therefore, Buddhism is different from other religions in the way that in Buddhism, there is no belief in a God, but a belief in ourselves. In other words, according to the Buddhist teaching, we believe that we have the ability to solve our problems rather than an outside God, because a God or a supernatural power, in fact, according to the Buddhist teaching, it's powerless to help us when our emotions comes up. For example, our emotions like anger. Maybe in this room, a lot of you already experienced this, particularly when you have a family, you have your husband, your wife, you may quarrel every day. Maybe some of you, not only, once, maybe several times for a day, these kind of emotions, when you have a kind of belief outside power, it's really the God is powerless. But the Buddhist teaching is different because Buddhism is a religion solely and primarily is teaching us to understand our emotions. Therefore, in order to control our emotion or manage our emotion, understanding is very important. So this is in Buddhism called the Four Noble Truths. Maybe you think that maybe it's a simple teaching, but this Four Noble Truths is quite important because it totally focuses on the human conditions. It never discusses gods, outside powers, but entirely emphasizing on the human condition. In other words, we as human beings, we experience happiness as well as suffering. Because we experience both of these things, therefore, we want happiness, we don't want suffering. And that is a very important thing Buddhism recognizes, because that is the eagerness. We want to abandon suffering and looking for happiness. And because of this, we are making efforts. Human efforts are very important, and Buddhism, in fact, recognizes human efforts for human happiness. And this is here, we have this is a diagnosis of human conditions. Therefore, the Four Noble Truths giving us a practical guide. So this guide is very important and related to our daily life, in fact. So this guide, when we practice it, it's particularly aiming for happiness. Maybe a lot of you think that, oh, Buddhism, as you said, but when we learn in our temples, masters, and the goal for learning Buddhism is nirvana. In fact, nirvana, when we explain from the Buddhist point of view, it's happiness, in fact. Therefore, the entire goal is looking for happiness. But Buddhist idea of happiness is very different from other religions in that, because other religion, when you look for happiness, you need to go to heaven. If you don't go to heaven, you can't get happiness, because that is permanent happiness. Because Buddhism is saying that, no, right here, right now, in this life, we can enjoy happiness. Why? Because the very foundation of human happiness is to have a right understanding of the human life. Without right understanding of human life, you will never attain happiness. But in fact, when we ask you if you want that permanent happiness in the heaven, and if somebody is saying that now you can go to there, and you say, no, I still have my kids and family, and I don't want to go to there now. But right here, Buddhism saying that we can achieve this kind of happiness within this life. That's why here the Buddhist teaching is very important. Important in the way that Buddhist teaching is a guideline, guide us gradually achieve this kind of goal. That is called the Four Noble Truths, as I said earlier. So I need to explain the Buddhist idea of truth. The Buddhist idea of truth means reality. Reality means that the truth really tackle our human problems. In our life, the reality is that, we have both suffering and also happiness. So these kind of things all are there. Therefore, when Buddhism says that Four Noble Truths, that is kind of four things. First, accept our sufferings. Accept our problems. We have problems. We need to accept it. After you accept it, then you will investigate these causes to the human problems. When you find the causes, and then you know that how to solve the problem, you know that. Therefore, these Four Noble Truths related to realities in our life. And these are the realities, therefore, these are not a kind of dogmas for you to blindly believe. Therefore, these kind of teachings need you to study, need you to understand. Without understanding, you will never achieve enlightenment, as we discussed last evening with Matthew. So understanding is a key to our human success and human happiness. Therefore, you will not blindly follow it as a dogma. Therefore, if we want to use this term, perhaps this method we can say it's quite scientific, in fact. Scientific in the sense that because Buddhism dealing actual human problems. In other words, what Buddhism talk about, what Buddhism discuss is all real, all happening in our life. Buddhism never discuss something, which is supposed to do so, which is conceptual. Buddhism always dealing with realities. And these realities in Buddhism is called truth. Four Noble Truths, in other words, dealing with our human realities. Buddhism offers some kind of practical solution to human problems. That is for Four Noble Truths, we call this. Therefore, these realities is very important. It's a Buddhist term for dukkha. Perhaps a lot of you in this room, you access to Theravada Buddhist teachings, the Pali, you know these words already. Dukkha means suffering. Suffering, usually, we use this term, suffering. But the Buddhist term, dukkha, covers more than that. That's why modern scholars today usually translate as unsatisfactoriness. We human beings like that. You have a large flat, you live there comfortably, but when you look at somebody else who have a much larger flat and you wanted more. So this kind of unrealistic or unsatisfactory is always there. So this, in fact, also coming back to our desire. We will discuss this kind of causes to human problem a little bit later. Control, dictate our life. Maybe you still think that that is only a Buddhist teaching. Maybe in reality there is some kind of soul there. In fact, modern science already told us. For example, Western psychology saying that very ideal called I, self, that kind of a concept is what we have built up, in fact. It's not born with us. Much more is neuroscience. Today's neuroscience saying that suppose if we have a soul, that means our brain working together must be, centered with one point. All others should be dictated by this one point. That means that one point is a soul. Soul dictate all our thoughts, must be. But neuroscience, after scanning our brain, and they find that, in fact, our brain is chaotic. There's no such kind of a center point from where all the orders are given to other things. No such kind of things. That's why modern neuroscience told us quite clearly there's no such kind of things called soul. No such kind of things, which dictate all our other thoughts or ideas. It is because of this, here comes to Buddhism. Buddhism is important because Buddhism is saying that we are full of ignorance. Because of ignorance, our ideas are so chaotic. That's why we need a systematic training. So this training called training of the mind. When we have a systematic training of our mind, and gradually our mind will embarking on an exercise or journey to have what we call logical thinking or what we call rational thinking. And if we use university terms, it's called critical thinking. So that is a very important part of the Buddhist teaching, in fact. That is called Yoniso Manasikara in Pali. Yoniso Manasikara means that you tracing the problem to its roots, to its sources. That exactly is what we call the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths is taking up human problems, you analyze it and tracing it back to its sources, tracing it back to its roots. When you find its roots, then you cut the roots, then there is no human problems. So this is a very important method, Buddhism teaching. Therefore, although Buddhism started the dukkha, therefore the Buddhist teaching is not pessimistic view, but realistic. Not pessimistic because according to this view or this Buddhist ideal, in fact, human problems or human difficulties or human sufferings can be solved if we train our mind in a systematic way. So that training is Buddhist meditation, in fact. All of you know that. Meditation is train our mind gradually realize all these human characteristics. So that is a very important training of the mind. So Buddhism told us that although we have this problem, as I said earlier, we need to identify the causes. And this causes means looking into the roots of the problem. That roots, of course, Buddhism usually says samudaya, in fact, coming to these three: craving, hatred, and ignorance. Buddhism says these are three roots of human problems. Remember, these are the roots, very important roots. Look at these three, and those of you maybe here, you learn the psychology, you will understand this is that craving and hatred, these are emotional problems. Emotional problems. Then the third one, ignorance, in fact, is a cognitive problem. So these two kind of problem, they mutually supporting each other and mutually, working together. In other words, why we have anger, hatred, it's because of our ignorance. And because of our ignorance, when somebody says something bad, something nasty, immediately you get anger, angry, and you want to fight. But it's when you gradually understand, hatred and craving, and after you analyze and study it, you understand it, and then you can easily control it. So take the family situation as example. For example, as we said earlier, husband and wife nearly every day fighting. Of course, smaller fightings, but sometimes, fighting grew bigger and bigger. Finally, you separate. That is the result. That's why fighting is not good. Anger is not good. So Buddhism really wanted to tackle these problems. Therefore, Buddhism teaching that in order to control our anger and manage our anger, you need to understand anger. If you do not understand anger, you can suppress it. But in the long run, you will, burst out and have much more huge impact. Therefore, understanding anger is very important. Understanding anger is actually coming to ignorance, in fact. It's because of our ignorance, we do not understand anger. That's why you explode your home, fighting your wife, husband, father, daughter, all fighting. That's why the first thing for us, in fact, Buddhism teaches us is understanding anger. Understanding anger also tackles ignorance. That means we learning Buddhism, gradually understand, in fact, there are several ways to control this. First, Buddhism says that we need to look into the larger and big pictures. Because when you or your wife, your husband, say something bad or criticize you or blaming you for something, and you immediately in your heart and mind, you feel, something not good. You want to fight back. That anger comes up. First thing you need to think about it is that you are learning Buddhism, and you are basically, your life's goal is for happiness. If you immediately fight back, all kind of happiness is gone. Why you are fight for that? That is the first very important thing you need to think about it. Because when you fight back, it's your wife, your husband, your father, and your children. All are your loved ones. You are fighting back. What is that meaning? If you go on that, there is no happiness in your family, no happiness in your life. That's why we should not fight back. That is the second way of thinking. Third way of thinking, in the Buddhist way, is that when your wife or husband, criticizing you, blaming you for something, and Buddhism say, when she or he blame you, that means there must be a cause. You sat down, analyzed, why she just criticized me? Because that cup placed in the wrong place. Why she criticized me? Because I didn't wash my hand before lunch. When you, thinking in this way, that anger gradually died out. Why? Because anger is one of these emotions, comes up very fast. It dies out also very fast. Comes up fast. I think a lot of you have this experience. When somebody just say one word, very nasty, immediately you get into anger. But on the same time, if that person says something very nice, immediately all your anger are gone. So that is anger, comes up fast and dies out very fast as well. That's why controlling this anger is understanding. Buddhist way taught us. So then understanding gradually also removes the ignorance. You gradually arise in wisdom. Very important. That's why Buddhism say, although craving and hatred, they are emotional aspects, you always, get us into a trouble, but you need to understand it. Understanding is related to it. That's why these are the two sides. When you understand it, gradually you can calm down yourself. And first is that then you understand he or she they are getting angry and blaming you, you immediately say that, oh, that is because of ignorance. Then she blamed me, he blamed me at this ignorance. You say that person is burning in fire. That fire of anger, in fact, immediately what you do, you lose compassion. You think that person, in fact, is suffering. She is suffering. Why? Because she is suffering from anger. So that means not only you will not fight back with your wife or husband, but at the same time, you wanted to help, in fact. That is a very important idea, in fact. That's why Buddhism always emphasizes on understanding. Understanding our emotions, hatred, craving. Craving is something comes up slow, dies out also very slowly. But once when it comes up, it's very, very strong. We will analyze this when we come to the causes of human sufferings. That's why the entire Buddhism, we can say, is that managing our emotions, craving and hatred. That is called Buddhist management of human emotions. When our emotions are managed well, then you will naturally live happily. Why we are not happy? Because these emotions disturbs us. Looking this way inside of us, we were working with ourselves. Because normally, what we do as ordinary people, when you have something, problems within you, you always blame others outside. In fact, real problems within ourselves. A lot of cases is because of our anger and our cravings. Craving can be manifested in various different ways. So when we discuss other, we will discuss. Therefore, it's not the external thing, in fact, that disturb our peace. It's in our inwardly mind. Because of this, we need to understand ourselves and learn from this. So the Buddhist teaching offers us some kind of method to teach. Therefore, the third one we usually call the nirvana, that is the end of suffering. End of suffering, why? Because according to the Buddhist teaching is that, and that, as we said earlier, craving, hatred, ignorance, these are the roots of the problem. When Buddhism is saying that when we learning, understand this, then these roots of the great hatred, delusion, sometimes also craving, these are we usually call the fire, gradually being removed. When the roots of the problem are removed, then that is called end of the suffering. Therefore, the Buddhist idea of happiness is practical. Buddhist idea of happiness can be reached here and now in this life. It's no need to go to heaven. In fact, even if we reach heaven, we may not, enter in such a way, and we might never conquer with our emotions. That's why today, perhaps some of you already know that many years back in the West, they published a book, and it's called Managing Your Emotions. When your emotions are managed well, then you will lead a better life and you will lead a successful life. It's not about IQ. We know that a lot of people in their young life, they are very intelligent, and these young boys, at the age of 15, they already get PhDs. But after PhD, what happened to that person? In fact, this kind of young boys, very intelligent, in fact, they did not lead a successful life. In fact, a lot of them suffer in their life later on. Why? Because although they have the intelligence, but they do not have the way to manage their emotions. Because in our society, we are all human beings. Since we are all human beings, our feelings are very important. If anything hurt our feeling, we get angry and you want to fight. When anything says something nice, your feeling, get better and you feel better, you feel good, then you want to talk to another person. You will like another person. You will associate with another person. That's why managing our emotion is a very important thing in our life to be a successful person, to be a happy person. So the entire Buddhism is about this, managing our greed or craving and hatred, this kind of emotions. In order to manage this, that's why we need to eliminate or gradually remove delusions about life. And that way, Buddhism saying that is a very practical, ethical way. And that way called Noble Eightfold Path, many of you know this. So this Noble Eightfold Path is a very practical, and in this practical way, it's laid down first the ethical conduct, and from there you have mental discipline. Usually we say meditation. Meditation is looking inwardly, looking into your emotions, and you want to achieve wisdom. That's why here, as we discussed in last night over dinner, Matthew said, without understanding, without wisdom, you will never achieve enlightenment. Wisdom here means right understanding and right intention. Understanding is a very important thing. Understand our life, understand the roots of our problems. Without understanding these kind of things, we will never remove the roots of the problems. That's why this kind of practice is very practical, and it's suited for each and every person. And we as individuals, we need to take the personal responsibility to our life. Therefore, the Buddhist advice to us is that if our life is not happy, you shall not blame others. Your parents, your siblings, your fathers, daughters. It's we ourselves, did not take the responsibility. That's why Buddhism is very different from the Western religion. Western religions always look outside, look the deities help, because that deity can never help our emotions. You might have some kind of mentally rely on something, but the emotion is still there. But Buddhism directly taken into, its main teaching is understanding of our emotions. That is a very important part of this. It is from here I'll come to today's main part of the lecture is dealing with human sufferings. So human suffering is the center concern of the Buddha. In other words, entire Buddhist teachings can be summarized saying that suffering. In other words, entire Buddhist teaching focusing on human suffering and wanted to solve these problems. That's why one of the Buddhist texts saying that, the Buddha said that both formerly and also now, Anuruddha is his disciple, it is just the suffering and cessation of suffering that I proclaim, that I teach. In other words, the Buddha, when he got enlightened until he died, there were 45 years. During these 45 years, his only concern is solve human problems. All others he didn't discuss. There are so many metaphysical questions regarding to how the human beings coming into the world, how the entire universe, created for the first time. And these kind of problems and these kind of issues, many of the other religions teachers come here wanted to have a discussion with the Buddha. The Buddha always remained silent. He never wanted to discuss these kind of things. Why? Because these kind of questions, whether we understand or not, they are not directly related to our life. In other words, even if we do not know the very origin of the human life, the very origin of the universe, we still here, we have problems. We have our problems, and we need to deal our problems. That's why the Buddha is very practical to such an extent that he always looking into human problems. The entire aim is to solve human problems. Very practical. So that's why when Buddhism introduced into China, Chinese religion, Confucianism, is also practical. That's why Buddhism, Confucianism, work side by side, promotion for the human happiness in China. This is very important because Buddhism concerned with the soul problems of human suffering. And because of this human suffering, therefore, Buddhism sat down and analyzed human life in order to understand why we are suffer, how we suffer, and how to, end up this suffering. That is the entire Buddhist teachings. That's why the focus here, you can say, is different from Western religion. Western religion, first thing is that you need to believe the God. If you do not believe in God, nothing is there. No further discussion. And the discussion cannot go on. But Buddhism is different. Buddhism here did not say any kind of God outside, but human suffering. We need to sit down, analyze, and understand it. So this human suffering, Buddhism saying that there are causes to human suffering. In other words, when the Buddha sat down at the Bodhi tree, he meditated and think over about human suffering. And he wanted to find the roots for human suffering. So what he is thinking over is about dependent arising. So the dependent arising is heart of the Buddha's teaching. And dependent arising, in fact, is an analysis of the human sufferings and tracing its roots. The Buddha started with why we have death, why we have suffering in this life. After a reasoning, he suddenly understands that because we have birth. If there is a birth, there must be death. Then he traced back the 12 links. I think a lot of you know these 12 links. And finally, he arrived in that human suffering at the very roots is ignorance. Ignorance about many things. Ignorance about ourselves, ignorance about our emotions, and ignorance about the surroundings, the world we are living in. It's because of this. Then we made a lot of mistakes, and then we suffer. So this is a very important discovery, and this discovery, in fact, is the truth, is the reality of human life. Even today, whatever, either religion, either psychology and neuroscience explain, human suffering. Although it's using different ways, at different methods, it's also coming back to ignorance because of our misunderstanding of the life. So that, in fact, is a very important discovery, and this discovery, in fact, made the Buddha as an enlightened human beings. So coming back to this dependent arising, that means in this world, all kind of things, they are linked together. Linked together by causes and conditions. In other words, the whole universe is working on cause and effects. Cause and effects. Therefore, the Buddha understands that we suffer, there must be causes. Then he traced back to this ignorance, and this ignorance is not only accessed now, accessed in the past, and will access it in the future before we get enlightened. Therefore, understand human life is the key to solve our problems. Therefore, as I said earlier, the Buddha is very practical to such a way that he does not want to engage in speculative metaphysical questions. This don't end. As we said earlier, very origin of the human life, very origin of the universe. He never discussed because all these are not so much related to our life. So Buddha wanted to really dealing into the actual human problem, actual human suffering. That is a very problem he wanted to do. That's why in the Buddhist text usually compares Buddha as a physician, as a doctor. We know that modern doctors or physicians, what they do is help us, cure our illness. The Buddha is the same way. I just wanted to solve our human problems, human sufferings. That's why it's a very, very practical concern. So here is that Buddhism coming back to this Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths, in fact, the Buddha created this as a way to deal with our human sufferings. So this is a very practical religious way. And first is we need to understand this suffering. Understand why we are suffer, how we suffer. And you will ask these questions. When you ask these questions again and again, then you will settle down to analyze it. Then you analyze it, you find the causes to suffering. When you find the causes, you need to gradually work to remove the causes. It's very practical as well. When the causes are removed, that is realized, happiness is there. And when you know the causes to the suffering, of course, you will find the path leading to the end of that suffering. So that is the Buddhist teaching of Noble Eightfold Path. So that is basically centered on human problems. All are centered on human problems. Although they are called Four Truths, but this Four Truths entirely focusing on the first truth, suffering. That's why the first truth become a center, a very important thing, and Buddhism emphasizes it, and we need to understand it. So Buddhism, in fact, analyzed this. First is that Buddhist way called Four Noble Truths, it's also way of thinking. It's not only the Buddhist idea of four truths, realities in our life. It's also in a way we need to, whatever the problem in your life, think in the way of Four Noble Truths. Think in the way of Four Noble Truths, that means you need to focus on the problems, focus on the difficulties, the issues. When you focus on human problems, and you will then settle down to analyze it. That's why this way of thinking is very important. We call it about thinking about causalities. Thinking about causalities, that means that problems comes up, there must be causes. When you think in this way, then you will find the causes to human suffering. And this suffering, of course, is related to what? It's a cognitive framework. Cognitive means related to our understanding of the human life, in fact. When we understand human life better, then we will understand how these, roots of the human problems comes up. That's why this four, when you first think about there is a suffering, there must be causes. That's what you think about. There must be causes. You find those causes. Where's these causes? And mostly internal causes. Why? Craving and attachment or hatred. And those who you learn psychology, you know that it's psychological terminologies. Craving is a psychological terminology. And hatred is another psychological terminology. Since it's psychological, it's within us, not outside. In other words, we're looking inside into us, all these causes are within us, in fact. You understand this. And since inside with us, that's why you need to have a training to remove this. That is about the Noble Eightfold Path. So these are the way of how we think about each of the human problems. Focusing on the problem and fighting the causes and make it as a habit. As a habit, you always think in that. That's why the Four Noble Truths is a guideline, and Four Noble Truths, it's a cognitive framework for us to gradually, make it a habit. We always think in that way. That's why the Buddhist teaching is not only, remain as a teaching, but we need to embed it in this in our life. in our life as a way of thinking. Therefore, when we have these human problems, the Buddhist idea is that we need to accept it. Human problems, sadness, all these things you need to recognize. We have so many problems in our life. First, look at this. Objectively, they exist. They are not bubbles. They are really problems in our life. Very important. You need to recognize. Recognize that. Second is accept. Accept we have problems. You don't reject. If you reject the problem, according to the Buddhist teaching, it will be more problems. Why? Because problem will evolve, change. And this problem evolve, change, and from a small problem come into a huger, bigger problem. And the problem grew so huge, so big, you cannot control. That's why so many people commit suicide. Nobody wanted to commit suicide. Why they commit suicide? Because they think that problems are so huge they cannot handle. That's why they commit suicide. That's why acceptance of our problem is a very important way. Don't reject it. Don't blindly thinking that, oh, no, these are the bubbles, they will go away. No. That's why acceptance our problem, acknowledging that means when you acknowledge it, accept it, that is applied here, Four Noble Truths, you immediately settle down and trace its roots, find its causes. That's why acceptance is very important. Our problems are real. They are not fake. Now, real problem, that's why accept it. When we accept it, then we will deal with this problem, how to deal it. That's why here comes to about right view, right thought, sometimes called right intention. Therefore, the right view sometimes translated as a right understanding. So right view or right understanding means understand what? Understand our problems you need. Because if you do not understand problem, how can you solve the problem? Therefore, you need to understand this problem. Since this problem related to our human life, it's a psychological problem. That's why Buddhism coming back to analyze our life. So analyze our life itself is to find the causes to the problem, in fact. That's why it's come to right view, right understanding. When you have the right view, this right view, that means you understand correctly and deal into human problem, you pay attention, right thought here comes up. These two, right view, right thought or right attention, I think a lot of you know in this room, in the Buddhist concept, these two are called wisdom, in fact. Wisdom. That's why here I write it here is wisdom-based actions. That's why we are going to take actions dealing with human problem, but this action is not a simple action. This action is an informed action. This action is based on right understanding of the human problems. That's why this is, because of the right view, right understanding, whatever the action we take is right action, is good action. We can solve the problems. That's why it's very important, as we discussed last night with Matthew together, right view or right understanding is so crucial to Buddhist studies. It's a starting point for practicing Buddhism. Without right understanding, you will never practice Buddhism in the correct way. You might practice wrongly, you don't know. That's why coming back, learning is very important. Learning, in order to have a correct understanding, right understanding, without learning, you don't know. Learning, of course, for example, in this classroom, it's a formal learning, and you can also read the book. You can listen to the monasteries, preachings, teachings. All are learning. And also you can learn from life, because learning, there are so many different kind of ways and method. But basically, you need to keep on learning, because right view is not a simple thing. Why? Because in our life, there are so many different kind of issues comes up. And these issues, some dealing with our emotions, some dealing with our moral aspect, some dealing with other kind of things. That's why we need to keep learning all the kinds of things, understand. So learning is a very important tool for us to raise right view, right understanding to our life and also the world we are living in. That's why it's a first thing we need to understand is that human life is like that. It's always full of problems. We need to understand. You shall never expect that human life without a problem. If in that case, that is already an enlightened person. We as ordinary people, it's always full of problems. Why? Because we live in a conditioned world, and our life is also conditioned. Since it's conditioned, it's always changing. Since it's changing, then it will always, bring us problems. That's why it's the sickness, old age, we can't avoid. That's why in the modern medical science, they will never say you are a healthy person. Why? Because our healthy condition is always changing. Today we might healthy, tomorrow immediately because of the cold or too hot, you get sick, you get ill. That's why, because of this is a human nature. That's why Buddhism says this is a realistic understanding of the human life. That is not pessimistic. Not pessimistic means that our condition we understand, then we can really deal with it. That's why, although Buddhism emphasizes on suffering, emphasizes on dukkha, in fact, emphasizing this means that Buddhism urges all of us to do something with our problems. Don't ignorantly just sit there, carelessly. Carelessly, that means you letting the problems to evolve. Evolving to such an extent that if you cannot control, that is really the worst. That's why emphasizing on suffering is urgently we need to do this. This is something we need to do. So here is, I just quoted from Rupa Ganjing. He is a professor of Buddhist studies at the University of Bristol. This is what he said. Rich in meaning and nuisance, the word dukkha is one of the basic terms of Buddhist and other Indian religions discourse. Literally means pain, anguish. In its religions and philosophical context, dukkha is, however, suggestive of an underlying sense of unsatisfactoriness or unease, or must ultimately may even our experience of happiness sometimes even included. In other words, we might have some kind of happiness, but very short, changing. That's why this kind of happiness is also included into dukkha. That's why it says that since any pleasant experience whatever its basis is ultimately unreliable and subject to loss, if we raise our hopes of a final happiness in it, we are born to disappoint. That is a scholarly interpretation. And this interpretation is true to the Buddhist text. It's very interesting. A scholar also, come to this. That's why Buddhism come to here. Of course, these are the three, basically, as a lot of you know this: ordinary suffering, emotional and physical pain, and also suffering as produced by change. And more importantly here, all pervasive suffering. Usually the text using is the five aggregates of clinging suffering. So the last part here is the most important part of Buddhist teaching, because this is related to the core of Buddhist teaching. Analyze the roots of human problems, in fact. So in order to understand this, we need to understand the five aggregates, because the five aggregates here explained is explaining what is human being, in fact. So the five aggregates here refers to groups. So basically, according to Buddhism, for a human being is considered of five groups: physical form, feeling or sensation, perception, mental formation, consciousness. So these are the five. So from these five, we understand that first is only the physical thing. Other four, all are psychological, all are mental. Therefore, Buddhism emphasizes on the psychological aspect of human life. It's very important. In other words, Buddhism totally dive into the psychological aspect of human life and analyze it and find the causes to human suffering and also human happiness. In other words, even happiness is a psychological thing, and suffering is also a psychological thing, in other words. All are psychological. So this is a form, so all others are psychological. I just that. So when we're looking into the physical aspect, of course, easy to understand, the five organs, which are very important. Why? The five organs, in fact, they are the doors to our mind. Through these five doors, we get all different kind of informations. After this information collected and goes back to our mind, the mind started to analyze the information, and this information being processed, and some become memory, some just abandoned. Therefore, although this is a physical form, but it serves as a basis for all others. Because if without this foundation, the basis, all others cannot exist. That's why the five all depends on this physical form, the physical basis. The second is this sense organs. Sense organs here refers to the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body. So as I said, these five senses, they are the doors getting all kind of informations and all coming back into our mind. So these informations, not only, when we read and looking into something, and we need to have, listening the music and the sense, the food, and the touchable sense, all these things are need. So this in the Buddhism saying that all these are called food for thought. When they collected, fit into the mind started to analyze. In fact, all these are, getting the informations. And that's why usually in the Buddhist text explain the first five here. The first five here, usually what we say. But Buddhism getting more deeper into the sense is that it's including the mind. The mind here also is a physical thing. If we interpret in this way, perhaps here, when we say the mind, here refers to our brains, our neurons, the physical thing. That physical thing contains its function is thinking, thoughts, and ideas. That's why Buddhism comes into six. But the last one, the mind, is the most important one because the first five, they are the doors getting information. It's all the information coming to the mind, and the mind started to analyze these informations. So these are all considered as a physical thing, remember. And we must remember, although they are physical, but we need to understand is that all these are changing. None of these are permanent. Since they are changing, so we should not think these are permanent, always going on. So we need to maintain a sense, idea of impermanence. Always changing impermanence. That understanding is very important, in fact. Then the second here, gradually coming into some very important thing, here is feeling. Feeling is a very important part in our life, and feeling also connected with our six senses, the eyes, ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. So with this, then we have pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, and neutrals. Since these feelings comes up, then Buddhism say the very idea of I also comes up. In other words, Buddhism do not recognize a permanent, everlasting entity as a soul, as a self, but Buddhism is saying that the idea of I, personality, is gradually built up, just like modern Western psychology, gradually built up. But this idea of I is not always present. For example, when you are asleep, the idea of I also sleep. It's only when we have a feeling, then idea of I comes up. This idea of I comes up, then that's why you say, oh, this is pleasant. When I look at the picture, very nice, pleasant, I want to possess it. And when you say something not so good, hear some noises, oh, dislike comes up, I don't want it. So this idea, I don't want it, I want to possess, all these are related to concept of I. So that I comes up. That's why feeling here is very important. That's why here use word qualitative tone, qualitative. That means good and bad comes up. Ethical idea comes up from here. Judgment comes up. That's why you have I want it. This is nice. This is something not good. I don't want. All. That's why the feeling here is a second step. Immediately the I concept comes up. And when this idea comes up, immediately the third one. That's when we discuss human life, we call it perception. Perception basically means recognizing and labeling. Recognizing means that, for example, when you look at somebody going on the road, you immediately notice it. That is called beard awareness. You know something moving. It only comes up perception second time, then you recognize, oh, that actually is a cat walking around. It's not a human being. It's only perception comes up. That's why perception have these four functions. In fact, more than this, but these are the four basic functions, very important to our life. First is recognition and identification. As I said, the immediately passing very fast when you notice something passed, and then when perception comes up, you know, oh, this is a cat. Then maybe you recognize, oh, this is a human being. This is the first part, a very important part, recognition. So recognition, in fact, related to what? Related to our memory, in fact. Because you have the idea of a cat already in your mind, that concept is already stored there. That's why when a cat passes, you can recognize. If you do not have the idea of a cat, even the cat passing, you don't know what is a cat. That's why that here perception related to our past memory, related to our what we have learned. If we do not have this part, even this cannot recognize. That's why this. After this labeling and naming, that's why here means that is a cat, that is a human being. That labeling comes up. So this labeling is again refers to our memory, our stored information there taken up. The third is recording. And when you, for example, all of you coming here and learning from this lecture, you deliberately doing this learning. After learning, you think some part is very good, gradually you commit into memory. Later on, after another maybe 1 month, 2 months, another person, discussing this, and says, I learned this, I know this. So that is another function. The fourth function is distinguishing its characteristics. Here, characteristics here means different kind of individual sense. Each individual have its own characteristics. Cat has its characteristics. That's why you can distinguish cat from the human beings. Even human beings, you know there's a male, female. You know the elderly person, young person. All are different. That's why this is a characteristic. That's why here you can say perception plays a very important role in our daily life. In fact, every moment we are using these perceptions. So this perception is a very important part in our daily activities, in our cognition of the world. So this part is already starting to, analyzing things. But more importantly is, of course, here, I need to add one more thing is here. It's a danger of perverted perception. In this perception, as I said earlier, when we notice something there moving, that is a build consciousness, you notice. And in the second thought, perception comes up, you realize this is a cat. How you realize cat? Because you learned. You have your memory. You know what is a cat. That's why here related to what you have memorized, learned already. That means you started to interpret that object, moving object. This moving object you interpret according to what you remembered, what you learned. So this interpretation is very dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that if in the past you learned something wrong, even if you learn something correct, if you use this memory to interpret the present thing, sometimes get perverted. But you don't know. Since it's a perverted interpretation, then you think it's true and you follow in and gradually apply this in your life, then it's get into problem. That's why the perverted interpretation, we call it distorted interpretation, it's already biased. Biased in the sense that in the past you have, for example, in the past you had a very bad experience with a cat. Therefore, this moving cat comes here and you immediately recognize this cat. Since you have this bad, accident with the cat, you immediately either run away from the cat or you want to chase the cat away. Why you do that? It's because you are bad, past experience. That's why this past experience, it's already influencing you at the present moment. In fact, the cat may be very innocent, may be a very good cat, never attach anybody. But your past very bad experience immediately comes up and you say, that cat might attack me. You will run away, do something. That is called perverted perceptions. We all human beings, we all have this. When you come like a friend, you just look at the facial expression, you will start to make judgment. Oh, that person, might be difficult. It's difficult to deal with. Sometimes you look at the facial expression, oh, that is a nice person. Maybe I can talk to him nicely. That is a perverted perception. But that person, whether he is good or bad or otherwise, because you have never associated with that person, never talked to that person actually. It's totally new boss. New boss coming into your company and he's going to deal with you. But you have your perception already there. That's why this perverted perception or distorted perception is very bad for us. That's why Buddhism says that we need to see things truly as they are. Remove these kind of perceptions, because these perceptions really can get us into a problem. Because this new boss coming into the company, maybe he is a very good boss. Just the facial expression may be not pleasant, but he might be a very diligent, very nice, whole, compassionate, kind-hearted person. You don't know. But your misperception already have a misjudgment already. That's why here Buddhism wanted to us to, not to have any judgment when somebody, human beings are the most important thing. Any kind of new human being comes here, you shall never have any pre-judgment. You just say human being and you try to, talk with the person and to understand that person. And Buddhism says that it's only when you have a long relationship with that person you truly understand the person. Otherwise, you won't understand that person. And this here, the fourth one here, it's called mental formation. It's called constructive aspect. Constructive means here you are going to make decisions. Construct means construct something. Just like building for example, 普明寺, you need to construct. After 1 year, 2 years, it's a beautiful monastery constructed. And here means doing something. That's why here related to another four. First is volition, will. Therefore, unlike the early ones, they are more passive. But here, volition is more active. You are going to make a decision. Just like as I said earlier, when you just notice this cat passing very fast, because of your bad experience with the cat, that cat attacked you, and this cat passing, and you are now making a decision. You are going to run away, for example. That is already coming out a volition, and you run away. You don't want the cat to attack you. So these making decisions, that's why here it's related to what we call karma. Karma means you make a decision. It's a volition, in fact. In Theravada Buddhism, maybe in this room you learned already, it says, what is karma? Volition is karma. So that is the Theravada Buddhist saying. In fact, in the Chinese agamas, there is no such kind of definition. We didn't find it. But in the Pali text said clearly, volition is karma, means making decisions. Why making decisions? It's based on earlier perceptions. That's why it's taken up this example. This new boss comes up. Although he has a feature, not looking, is not nice, but you make a judgment, this might be a difficult person to deal with. You are going to make a decision already. So that decision certainly is a wrong decision already. That's why this decision is based on early one perceptions. And next is a response to conditions. That means just like somebody come, a cat going on, these are the conditions. The conditions always change. That's why your response also always changing. Changing to whatever. So this changing, you are responding in the sense, and also bringing back your past experience, past memories also come into being. And these things, in fact, started to play a very important role and inform your decisions. The third one here, it's we say root of karma. It's because of this volition, then you certainly make a decision. For example, this cat, you have a bad experience, you immediately, you will chase the cat or beat the cat. That is already a karma. You are beating a cat, and with intentionally you want to do something. So already a karma is already. And next, the mental factor. Mental factor here related to, your main idea here is consciousness, and here these factors all comes up and helping all others. Now, there are a lot of mental factors. In fact, here, volition is a very strong mental factor. Other mental factors, for example, greediness is one, hatred, delusion, generosity, wisdom, all are mental factors. So this mental factor, that means when our mind arises, and this mental factor also arises. So when you have a bad feeling with a cat, then what? Hatred becomes more strong. All other factors, delusion, generosity, wisdom, not so powerful. So when this hatred comes strong, then you make a decisions. So that's why it's here. Many other factors also comes up. So these are the volitional formations. So this part is a major part, and this part is making all kind of decisions we call karma here performing. The last one called consciousness. In fact, consciousness builds awareness, as we said earlier. It's called awareness. So this build awareness functions as a very important part. In other words, when our eye sees something, immediately the build consciousness arises. Because it's related to eye, therefore we call this eye consciousness. When we hear something good or bad noises, then consciousness also arises. Therefore we call this ear consciousness. Therefore, there are 6 types of consciousness related to our 6 senses. The eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. The mind, of course, consciousness is the most important part. Most important part. That's why here is coming back to build consciousness. That's why here I say, when somebody moving very fast, you immediately build consciousness comes up. You say something moving. So that is coming back to consciousness, in fact. And then this consciousness, then you further, come to kind of perception, and you refer to your past memory. Oh, that in fact is the cat. All the characteristics of the cat you recognize it. So perception distinguishes all these characteristics. So that is already coming to the second. That's why the consciousness is a build consciousness, but a very important part. It's throughout all these 6 doors, all are there. All these are there. Come back. Sorry. These consciousness will say they are mutually dependent on. Mutually, all. In other words, the consciousness depends on all others, the physical form, the feeling, and the perception, the volition, all depends on each other. They are not functioning independently. Although we are taking one of them, emphasize it, and in order to explain. In a real life situation is that all this working together. Just in one point here, one of the mentality may be leading is the most important part. That's why I name it. It is this kind of consciousness, in fact, it's working throughout our life, It's only the last, the mental consciousness becomes the most important part of the consciousness. And that consciousness, in fact, functions. Therefore, when we think about consciousness, although it's distinguishing into 6 consciousness, then Mahayana Buddhism, we call the Yogacara Buddhism, distinguish into 7th consciousness, 8th consciousness. All these are functions of one consciousness. In other words, although we call 6 consciousness or 8 consciousness, in fact they are 6 or 8 functions of one consciousness. Only one consciousness, but functions very differently. So that is consciousness. And It's already 11:22. You want to have a short break? Yeah? Okay. Have a short break. Yeah. Okay.